What happens when the CEO of a major restaurant chain walks into his own store, dressed like an everyday customer, and gets turned away like he doesn't belong? What he discovers next will shake the entire company and uncover a truth no one saw coming. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind that slips by without much fuss. The sun was beginning to dip behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the sidewalks of downtown. People rushed in and out of shops, briefcases in hand, coats half-buttoned, the usual hum of a weekday winding down. Jeremiah Cole stepped out of his rideshare across the street from Haven and Hearth's flagship restaurant, tall windows, polished gold signage, valet attendants in crisp uniforms. The place looked exactly how he designed it years ago, elegant, modern, and warm. But lately, whispers had been drifting through the grapevine. Comments in customer surveys, anonymous emails, small things. Really, still, they stuck with him. Words like, ignored, different treatment, and more than once, if you don't look a certain way, you don't get seated. So today, Jeremiah wasn't showing up as the founder, or as the CEO whose name still sat on the original incorporation papers. No suit, no team, just jeans, a plain jacket, baseball cap, and sunglasses. He wanted to see what it felt like walking into his own business without the nameplate and title, without the automatic respect. As he stepped inside, the scent of garlic butter and grilled seafood wrapped around him. The lighting was low, golden, inviting. A man in a pale blazer and expensive-looking watch entered right before him. They stood side by side at the host stand. The hostess, young, cheerful, beamed at the man in the blazer. "Welcome back, Mr. Langston. Your usual table?" "Of course." The man smiled. "Glad you remembered." A few moments later, it was Jeremiah's turn. A young man with a sharp haircut and tight black vest stepped up. His name tag read, Colby. He glanced at Jeremiah, then past him. "Yeah, we're full right now, if you want to wait. There's a bench over there." Jeremiah didn't say much, just nodded slightly. "Mind if I take a look at the menu while I wait?" he asked. Calm, pleasant. Colby shook his head, not rudely, but not kindly either. "Menus are for seated guests." Jeremiah glanced over just in time to see a young couple walk in, white, maybe in their late 20s. Dressed casually, laughing. They didn't have a reservation either. But Colby smiled, tapped something on the iPad, and within seconds, they were being shown to a table. He waited, watched. Another guest came in, older woman, also white, not on the list, still seated with grace and care. He counted at least 3 other interactions like that before he slowly turned and walked back outside. On the sidewalk, he stood for a moment, letting the sounds of the city filter back in. A delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere, a street saxophonist played a slow, winding tune. He didn't feel angry, not yet. But something deep inside twisted. He'd built Haven and Hearth on values that mattered to him. Hospitality, fairness, comfort, no matter who you were or what you wore. And now, that promise was bending in ways he hadn't seen coming. He didn't go back to the office that evening. Instead, he walked, block after block, just thinking. It could have been one employee, a one-off. Maybe a young man like Colby was just having a bad day. But Jeremiah had learned a long time ago that when something doesn't feel right, it's almost never just one thing. It's a thread, and if you pull it gently enough, something much bigger might start to unravel. He adjusted his cap and turned toward the subway. Whatever this was, it wasn't ending here. That night, long after the last elevator dinged in the high-rise lobby and the office lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, Jeremiah sat alone in the executive suite of Haven and Hearth's Manhattan headquarters. The city outside pulsed with light and movement, but inside his corner office, the silence was thick. He leaned back in his chair, cracked open his laptop, and typed in his login like he'd done 1,000 times before. Only this time, there was something different in the way his fingers hesitated. He began combing through customer service reports from the last quarter. At first, it was the usual mix. Compliments about the ambiance, minor complaints about wait times, But tucked in between the routine notes were patterns he couldn't ignore. A handful of flagged comments, many of them from guests of color. Older individuals, or those described as not dressed appropriately, repeated words that hit too close to home. Treated coldly, ignored, judged. A name surfaced in his memory. Nina Garvey, his executive assistant, sharp, composed, one of the few who ever pushed back when something didn't sit right. Weeks ago, she'd made an offhand remark during a briefing about inconsistencies in guest experience data. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now, it rang in his ears like a bell. He picked up his phone. Nina answered on the third ring. "Sorry to call so late," Jeremiah said. "You remember that thing you mentioned, about the guest experience data?" There was a pause. "Yeah," she said slowly. "Why? I saw something tonight. I need you to pull everything. Full audit logs, unfiltered reports, anything related to guest treatment protocols." Another pause. "You finally saw it, didn't you?" "I did." Nina came in 30 minutes later. Coat still damp from the drizzle outside. She brought her personal laptop, a backup drive, and a folder thick with notes she'd quietly kept on her own time. They spread everything out on the conference table. No distractions, no politics, just facts. There was one document that chilled Jeremiah, a 2-week-old anonymous email from someone claiming to work in operations. It warned of an unspoken culture of guest categorization, suggesting that employees had been informally trained to assess customers based on appearance. The message had been forwarded to a general inbox and promptly ignored. "Look at the date," Nina said, pointing to the timestamp. "This was before I even mentioned it to you." Jeremiah rubbed his jaw, his mind already spinning ahead. "So, what's our starting point?" "Depends how honest you want this to get," she said, "because if this thing's real, it didn't start at the front desk. It started with how we trained them, who we promoted, and who we let slide." He looked at her. "Then we trace it to the source." Nina nodded. "I'll need unrestricted access to internal training archives, HR notes, and regional manager reports. I'll make it happen." They worked side by side well past midnight, pulling files, old emails, digging through archived data manually after discovering that most digital records had been conveniently migrated to a restricted access directory. When Jeremiah called IT to ask why his access was suddenly limited, the reply came quickly. "Scheduled maintenance," they said. "System updates for efficiency." Right. They moved to the backup archives, physical binders and old servers kept for legal compliance. Hours in, Nina's voice broke the silence. "Jeremiah, look at this." She slid a printed PDF across the table. It was a summary report from an internal survey labeled, "Unverified, do not circulate." More than 30 entries from employees describing moments where guests were turned away, seated last, or treated differently based on their clothing, speech, or skin tone, all dismissed under vague justifications like, guest wasn't aligned with brand identity. Jeremiah read each line, carefully, word by word, his shoulders tensed as he reached the bottom. "These aren't isolated," he said. "No, and they're not new, either," Nina replied. "They were hidden." There was a stillness between them for a moment. Jeremiah leaned back, staring at the ceiling like the answer might be written in the plaster. He didn't speak, but something shifted behind his eyes, like a line had been crossed. And there was no walking it back. Nina reached for her coffee, now lukewarm, and set it down with a soft clink. "Someone's already sweeping this under the rug," she said quietly. "They know what you saw, and they're getting ahead of you." Her words hung there, like a whisper carried on the tail end of a storm. By Tuesday morning, the main conference room on the 24th floor was filled with familiar faces, regional managers, HR leads, and the heads of training programs. The nameplate outside the door read, "Quarterly Performance Review." But Jeremiah knew exactly what he was looking for, and it wasn't sales numbers. He stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, no slideshow behind him, just a plain whiteboard and a marker in his hand. Nina sat quietly near the back, her notepad open, ready. "Before we get into numbers," Jeremiah began, scanning the room, "I want to take a closer look at how we define service. Specifically, how our teams are trained to treat first-time guests." There was a flicker of unease around the table. Chairs shifted. A few eyes dropped to folders. He let the silence breathe for a moment before continuing. I've received feedback, some of it firsthand, that suggests we might be placing certain guests ahead of others. Not by reservation or timing, but by how they look, how they dress, who they appear to be. A manager from the Southeast cleared his throat, mumbling something about brand consistency. A woman from HR said they'd never instructed staff to discriminate. But certain expectations were implied in training to align with premium standards. Then Leonard Trask, the regional director of the Northeast, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Look, he said, we're not turning people away for sport. We're adapting. You know how competitive this market is. If we don't make high-spending clients feel special, they'll walk next door. Jeremiah didn't respond right away. He just watched Leonard's eyes, the way they kept flicking away, never landing. It wasn't the words that struck him. It was the tone. Defensiveness layered with something more. Something practiced. The meeting wrapped up without fireworks. Just vague reassurances and polished deflections. Jeremiah thanked everyone and stepped out without much fanfare. But he didn't head back to his office. He nodded at Nina instead. Let's find Tasha. Tasha Mitchell had worked at the Midtown location until a little over a year ago. She was smart, observant, and according to Nina's quiet records, she'd left under mutually agreed separation after filing a complaint that never made it past the first review. They met her at a coffee shop in the Bronx, low-key, quiet, with music playing soft enough not to interrupt conversation. Tasha looked hesitant at first, fidgeting with her sleeves, but as soon as Jeremiah assured her that this was off the record, her voice steadied. I used to love that job, she said, until I started noticing the pattern. Who got greeted first? Who got seated by the windows? Who got offered the premium wine list without asking? It wasn't subtle. Jeremiah listened closely, arms folded on the table. Tasha went on. New hires were never told directly to discriminate. But it was in the training. In the examples, we were taught that priority guests looked a certain way. White, well-dressed, confident. Everyone else? You treat them polite, but firm. Minimal effort. The unspoken rule was, make it easy for the kind of customer who makes the place look expensive. Nina took notes as Tasha explained how she'd tried raising concerns. Once, maybe twice, but after that, her schedule started shifting. Fewer hours, more difficult shifts. Eventually, she was told her tone wasn't aligned with company values. I don't want anything from you, Tasha said as she stood to leave. Just fix it, please. That place broke a lot of people without ever laying a hand on them. Back at headquarters, Jeremiah asked Nina to pull all training documentation from the last 3 years. She returned an hour later, tight-lipped. The files were just updated last week. She said, new formats, sanitized. They're clean as a whistle now. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. He wasn't surprised, but that didn't dull the frustration. Somebody had seen this coming. As Nina stepped out, Jeremiah went digging through the employee network directory. One name popped back into view, Colby Reed, the young man at the Midtown host stand. A deeper look into his file showed something else. Personal referral from Leonard Trask. And there it was, a thread beginning to pull. Jeremiah sat in silence for a long minute, the city lights starting to flicker outside the tall windows. Then his email chimed. It was a single message. No signature, no attached file. Subject: you've only seen the surface. There's more you need to know, but I can't send it over the system. Meet me. The night had an edge to it, one of those evenings where the air felt just heavy enough to keep your shoulders slightly tense. Jeremiah and Nina sat side by side in the back corner of a narrow cafe in Brooklyn. The kind of place with chalkboard menus and lighting dim enough to hide your mood. A small table, 2 black coffees, and 1 USB drive sat between them. They didn't have to wait long. A tall man in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and eyes that had seen better years, slipped into the seat across from them. He didn't smile. He didn't reach for the coffee they'd ordered him. You came, Jeremiah said. The man nodded. I almost didn't. Marcus Hale, Nina said quietly. You used to work in back-end systems, right? Until I saw too much. Marcus replied, eyes scanning the room, and said the wrong thing about it. He reached into his backpack, worn and taped at the seams, and pulled out an old external hard drive, dusty, black, and dented on one corner. He placed it on the table like it was radioactive. "This," Marcus said, tapping the case with one finger, "is a snapshot of the system 3 years ago. Emails, training modules, scorecards. It was called Project Image. Unofficial name, of course. Never showed up in company memos." Jeremiah leaned in. "What exactly were you scoring?" Marcus met his gaze. "Guests. Based on how they looked, how they spoke, their names, sometimes even the zip codes on their loyalty profiles. There was a 3-color system: red, yellow, green. Green got the warm welcome, the smile, the best table. Red, delay, deflect, and if possible, quietly deny." Nina sat back, eyebrows raised. "And staff followed this?" "They were told it was just to maintain the brand standard. Nothing written. All implied. Leonard and a few regional directors were the architects. I don't think everyone involved realized how far it went." Jeremiah asked him to send over the files. Quietly and securely, Marcus agreed, but his voice turned sharp. "I'm not giving you this to get even," he said, "but if this goes public and someone decides to come after me, I need to know I won't be the one hung out to dry." "You'll be protected," Jeremiah promised. "We'll get legal coverage in writing." After Marcus left, Jeremiah and Nina sat for a long moment, watching the hard drive like it might crack open on its own. Neither said much. The reality was sinking in, not just that something ugly had festered within the company, but that it had been built, maintained, and disguised in ways they hadn't expected. The next morning, Jeremiah called an off-the-record meeting with the company's legal counsel. Helen Brooks, a seasoned attorney with a calm presence and eyes that missed nothing, sat across from him. "We need an independent investigation," Jeremiah told her, "and whistleblower protection for anyone who comes forward." Helen listened carefully, arms crossed. "If you go down this path," she warned, "you won't just be exposing a few bad apples. You'll be tearing at the roots. People will fight back, and they won't fight clean." "I don't want clean," Jeremiah said. "I want the truth." That same afternoon, word spread that Leonard Trask had called a closed meeting with several regional directors. Nobody knew what was said, but leaks trickled out within hours. He'd ordered a system refresh, which, in less formal terms, meant deleting anything prior to 2023 from the company's shared drives. By nightfall, Nina received a discreet message from a young manager named Jalen, freshly promoted. Nervous, but loyal, he'd trained under Tasha before she left. "Leonard's drawing up a restructuring plan," Jalen texted. "He's planning to push out anyone who asks too many questions. Wants it to look like performance reviews." Jeremiah took the news in silence. Then he sat at his desk, plugged in Marcus's hard drive, and opened the first folder. He scrolled past rows of timestamped emails until he found a document labeled Guest Profile Summary, Flagship Market. The name, Jeremiah Cole, sat halfway down the page, with a guest code and a yellow highlight next to it. VIP status, provisional. Estimated profile, mid-level executive. Visual brand alignment, moderate. He stared at it for a long time. 3 years ago, someone in his own company had watched him walk through the door, not as the founder, not as the CEO, but as a face to be scored. And somehow, the system had let that slide through. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "I let this happen," he said, "and I didn't even see it." The rented conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and fresh carpet glue. It was tucked inside a modest midtown hotel, far from the sleek glass walls of Haven and Hart's headquarters. And that was the point. Jeremiah didn't want familiar eyes. He wanted neutral ground, safe ground. Around the table sat 6 people, each chosen for a reason. Nina, focused as ever, was already flipping through her notes. Helen Brooks sat beside her, dressed in gray, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a hard drive tucked beside his elbow like a piece of contraband. Across from them sat Jalen and Renee, 2 junior managers who had offered to speak, as long as their names stayed out of any recording, for now. Jeremiah stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled, no laptop, just a printed outline in his hand. "This is what we know," he began. Project Image existed, It trained staff to treat people differently based on how they looked. Some of you lived it. Some of you saw it. He paused, looking around. Our goal isn't just to expose it. We need to prove that it was deliberate, that it was approved at the highest level, and that it harmed people, employees, and guests. Helen raised her hand slightly. I need to say this clearly. If you want a real outcome, a systemic correction, this may need to leave the walls of this company. Civil rights groups, press, even state regulators. I'm not ruling that out, Jeremiah replied, but I want to give the company a chance to fix this from within. If we take it outside first, everyone goes into survival mode. They'll lie. They'll lawyer up. I need to see who's guilty and who's just been silent. Marcus nodded once, his expression unreadable. It's a smart call. Just don't wait too long. While they plotted their next steps, Leonard Trask was already moving pieces on his own board. That same morning, he summoned all regional managers to a private virtual meeting. The message came wrapped in pleasant language: efficiency review, long-term vision, but the details were clear. A full realignment of personnel was coming. New policies, new expectations, no mention of fairness, just numbers and compliance. Those with known ties to Jeremiah, Tasha, or Marcus suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. A few received vague notices about their attitude and alignment. Others were temporarily suspended. The message was quiet, but loud enough. Stay in line or step aside. Meanwhile, Nina was back in the system. Late that night, she sat in the office she had once kept neat and predictable. Now it was cluttered with drives, printouts, and sticky notes pinned across the wall like a detective's map. She dug deeper into the servers, bypassing main directories, until she found something curious: a hidden drive, locked behind layered permissions. Only 3 users had access: Leonard Trask, the deputy head of our, and a third name redacted under a corporate ID linked to the Miami office. She frowned, typing faster. Come on, show me what you're hiding. She deployed a lightweight script, nothing fancy, just enough to quietly ping when someone accessed or deleted files in that drive. Within minutes, a notification hit her screen. File deleted. System, guest_behavior_log, branch_Midtown. Timestamp, 2:37 a.m. User, LTRASK. Nina's mouth tightened. That was Leonard. He'd been in the building the same night they'd found Marcus's files. He was already trying to clean house. The next morning, Jeremiah composed an email addressed to every regional director. Subject: Invitation, Guest Experience Quality Review. Body: As part of our commitment to fairness and excellence, all regional leaders are asked to attend a session to evaluate how our service standards are meeting modern expectations. Your presence is expected. It sounded harmless enough, but it wasn't just a review. It was a stage, and the spotlight was coming. That afternoon, Nina received an anonymous message in her inbox. No text, just a single video file. She hesitated only a second before opening it. It was grainy, but clear enough to make out 3 figures in a poorly lit storage area behind the Midtown location. One of them was Colby. Another was unmistakably Leonard. The third? Still a mystery. Male, older, standing just outside the light. They weren't talking about reservations or menus. They were planning. Nina leaned in closer, turned up the volume. We don't need to fire anyone, Leonard said in a low voice. Just push them sideways until they quit. Quiet and clean. The man beside him didn't respond, just nodded. The camera cut off a moment later. Nina sat back in her chair, heart pounding. There it was, in their own words. The mask was starting to slip. Jeremiah sat in his office with the lights dimmed low, the screen in front of him frozen on a single frame from the video. The shadows made it hard to make out everything, but Leonard's profile was unmistakable: rigid jaw, a slight tilt in his posture when he was trying to assert control. Colby stood near him, arms crossed and uneasy, clearly the junior player in the room. But the third man lingered at the edge of the frame. No name, no clear shot of the face, but something in the way he moved struck a chord. Jeremiah leaned in, rewound, paused again. The slight lift of the chin, the way he kept his hands tucked behind his back, it reminded him of someone he hadn't seen in years. Helen stood just behind him, watching, You think that's Gavin Marr, don't you? Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out an old folder. Inside was a copy of a business proposal from 4 years ago, clean fonts, bold margins, and a name at the bottom. Gavin Marr, Strategic Market Advisor. He used to run Southern Expansion. Jeremiah said, brilliant with numbers, terrifying in meetings. He always said we needed to separate emotion from efficiency. Helen raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a man who'd invent something like Project Image. Marcus joined the call from home. Static crackling briefly before his voice came through. That's him, no doubt. Gavin built the first iteration. I saw his name on the earliest commit logs when we were testing behavioral tracking. Once the tool worked, Leonard took it over and Gavin disappeared from the project. Helen let out a slow breath. If we bring Gavin into this, the whole foundation starts to crack. But he's careful. Private legal counsel. No paper trail. He moves in the shadows. Jeremiah tapped the edge of his desk. We need someone inside. Someone who knows how he operates. Nina, already working 2 steps ahead, made a few calls of her own. Late that evening, she sat across from a former colleague from the Miami office, someone from the legal department she hadn't spoken to in years. The conversation was polite, layered in code. So, how's Gavin doing these days? She asked over the phone. Swirling tea in a chipped mug. Still polishing reputations, came the reply. Last I heard, he's been helping brands navigate difficult customers by adjusting data models. You know, behavioral segmentation. That phrase lingered in Nina's mind long after the call ended. Behavioral segmentation, a sanitized way of saying, exclude the people who don't fit the image. Back at headquarters, Jeremiah and Helen connected the dots. This wasn't just a Haven and Hearth issue. If Gavin had recycled this model elsewhere, then Project Image, or some version of it, might have already spread through their partner brands, franchised locations, and industry circles. This is systemic, Helen said. If we don't shut it down here, it keeps growing. While they pieced the larger puzzle together, Leonard moved fast. He launched what he called Operation Integrity. In reality, it was a targeted sweep of dissent. Employees were handed loyalty agreements disguised as harmless policy updates, clauses about data confidentiality, social media conduct, and a quiet line about upholding brand values. Some signed, others hesitated. Then the suspensions began. First came emails with vague phrasing, pending review of conduct. Then came temporary removals, particularly for anyone who had spoken with Jeremiah, Nina, or shown signs of independent thinking. One branch manager, Andrea Lim from Queens, had quietly supported Jeremiah's efforts. She helped compile timelines, sent over screenshots. That morning, she was placed on administrative leave for questionable collaboration. Before signing off, she sent a simple message to Nina. I tried, but they're erasing everything. You have to act now. The weight of it all pressed down on Jeremiah like a slow tide rising. In his mind, this had started as a test of fairness, a question of dignity in customer service. Now it was a full-blown reckoning. That afternoon, Helen walked into his office, her heels soft against the carpet. I need to show you something. She handed him a thick folder. Inside, a petition, 11 names, 11 signatures from current employees. Below it, a formal request. They were asking for an external investigation, independent, federal if needed. The message was clear. If Jeremiah didn't act, they would. You have 48 hours. Helen said gently. They believe in you, but they won't wait forever. Jeremiah stared at the folder. The names written in ink. Each one a risk taken. He felt the clock ticking. He'd come too far to turn back. But the next move would define everything. Who he really was. And what kind of company Haven and Hearth would become. Outside his office, the city lights flickered against the windows. Quiet, watching. Jeremiah didn't sleep the night before. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing with every name, every document, every voice that had told him something wasn't right. When the morning came, he slipped on his blazer like it was armor. He didn't feel brave. He just knew he couldn't keep waiting for the perfect moment. He called a private meeting on the top floor of the Midtown Haven and Hearth building. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, The sun poured in hot and sharp, cutting across a long mahogany table where 6 chairs were filled: Helen, Nina, Marcus, Renee, Jalen, and a junior legal associate who barely looked old enough to vote but had a mind like a trap. Jeremiah stood at the head, eyes steady. "We move now," he said. "No more waiting. I'll take it to Leonard's face." In front of everyone, Helen folded her arms. "Jeremiah, if you rush this, they'll accuse you of making it personal. They'll say this is a power grab, that you're using your position to humiliate a peer." He nodded slowly. "Let them say it. We'll have the truth, the documents, the footage, and more than that, we have people who lived it. I'll take the risk." Helen gave him a long look, then leaned forward. "Then make sure the first blow is clean." By noon, the company's annual leadership summit was underway, this year rebranded as the National Service Quality and Fairness Initiative. Leonard had helped coin the name himself. He believed this was Jeremiah's way of managing a PR crisis. He arrived early, shook hands with regional managers, smiled for cameras, and took his place just a few chairs away from the stage. The room was filled with over 100 department heads, directors, and franchise stakeholders. The air buzzed with chatter, half anticipation, half skepticism. Jeremiah stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the mic, took a breath, and began. "Today is not about a policy launch. It's about accountability." The room stilled. He clicked the remote. The giant screen behind him lit up with a chart. Color-coded rows and columns, red, yellow, green. Each row labeled with phrases like guest demeanor, visible affluence, ethnic ambiguity, compliance with brand aesthetic. Gasps. A few murmurs. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. "These are internal documents," Jeremiah continued. "They were part of a program known as Project Image, a program that influenced how staff were trained to treat our guests. Not based on service needs, but based on appearance." He clicked again. Now came a slideshow of excerpts from internal emails. One read, "Avoid placing non-brand favorable guests near windows." Another, "We need to maintain upscale optics, train hosts to seat accordingly." Some managers shifted in their chairs. A few lowered their heads. One man in the back quietly stood and exited the room. Then Leonard rose. "This is ridiculous," he said, voice sharp. "These materials are taken out of context. No one ever approved a program like this. I never authorized this kind of garbage." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "You didn't have to sign anything, Leonard. Your people carried it out under your watch. And there's video footage, taken just behind the Midtown location, where you, Colby, and Gavin Marr discuss handling the fallout of this exact situation." Leonard's face darkened. "That footage is inadmissible. It was taken without consent." Helen stood. "Regardless of its admissibility, we have enough grounds to trigger an emergency review under Article 9 of our governance charter. Leonard Trask is hereby placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." There was a beat of stunned silence. Leonard's jaw clenched. This is a setup. He gathered his notes and stormed down the aisle. But retaliation came swiftly. Just before the meeting ended, an email pinged every inbox across the company. The subject line read, "Urgent internal alert, unlawful executive behavior." The message was anonymous but dressed in formal language. It claimed that Jeremiah had orchestrated a months-long plan to entrap Leonard in order to remove him from the leadership ladder. That the so-called evidence was manipulated. That Jeremiah had used company funds to pay informants and stage conflicts. The reaction was immediate. Managers whispered in corners. Some checked their phones, brows furrowed. Others made eye contact with Jeremiah but offered no smiles. Nina overheard someone mutter, "Now I don't know who to trust." The press began circling the building before the summit even ended. 2 vans parked outside. 1 camera crew loitered near the revolving doors. The headline was already forming: Corporate Civil War or Whistleblower Revolution? Late that night, Jeremiah returned to his office. Exhausted, his inbox was a battlefield. Legal questions, board requests, HR concerns, supportive messages, and not-so-subtle threats. But one item sat on his desk, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. It hadn't been there that morning. He tore the seal, peeled back the packaging, and stared. Inside was a contract, an agreement between Gavin Marr and a major hospitality conglomerate. Executed 6 months ago. Buried in the fine print was a chilling phrase: implementation of client-facing behavior grading algorithm across select regions. It was signed, stamped. This wasn't over. Jeremiah sat behind his desk, eyes locked on the contract he had just received. He tilted the paper toward the light, tracing the signature at the bottom, Gavin Marr. Bold and unmistakable. The date stamped beside it matched precisely with the period Marcus was dismissed. It wasn't a forgery. This was the kind of smoking gun most people never got. Helen leaned over his shoulder, scanning the fine print. This confirms Gavin's involvement. It connects him to the national rollout and proves Project Image was never just a local mistake. She looked up at Jeremiah. But if we drop this now, the media frenzy will shift. Leonard becomes yesterday's news. Gavin becomes the lightning rod. Jeremiah nodded, tapping a pen against the desk. Which might be exactly what Leonard wants. Helen continued, voice lower now. But if we hold this back long enough to make them think they've won, we might be able to turn them against each other. Divide the damage. He sat back, thinking, then gave the signal. Let's take that route. Nina made contact with a legal go-between, a former mediator who once worked with Gavin's team during a hospitality data privacy settlement. Through him, they sent a message, carefully worded, but firm. Gavin had 2 options. Walk away from all advisory roles related to guest classification systems and release a formal retraction, or Jeremiah would personally hand the signed contract to every journalist, regulator, and civil rights attorney in the country. The reply came by nightfall. Gavin didn't call. He didn't respond privately. Instead, he posted a 2-paragraph statement on his professional social media account. Cloaked in corporate language, he acknowledged that some experimental initiatives in consumer perception modeling may have been inappropriately localized, and expressed willingness to assist in any internal evaluations. It was a non-apology, but it said enough. Gavin was trying to pull out quietly. Leonard, however, read it differently. He saw abandonment. The next morning, a fresh set of documents surfaced, this time from Leonard's own camp. Leaked to a known business blog. They included a collection of outdated memos and one policy draft allegedly approved by Jeremiah 3 years earlier. The draft outlined strategic guest targeting, based on brand alignment, economic forecasting, and behavioral profiling. The implication was clear. Jeremiah hadn't just inherited the problem, he'd helped create it. News outlets jumped in. The narrative fractured. One headline read, CEO fights to save company from within. Another countered, was he in on it all along? Commentators debated whether Jeremiah was a reformer or just cleaning up his own mess. Stock tickers for Haven and Hearth dipped 5 points by afternoon. 2 investors reached out to the board with requests for clarity. Meanwhile, things inside the company started to fray. Marcus noticed that 2 of his former tech team members, both of whom had offered to help with the internal audit, were suddenly summoned by Hour. Nina confirmed it. They were being re-evaluated for prior conduct violations. Old compliance flags dug up and given new scrutiny. Leonard's not backing off, Marcus said as they regrouped in a side office. He's trying to wear us down. Slow drip. Let us fight ghosts while he slips out the back. Jeremiah nodded grimly. Or he's buying time to wipe the servers clean. That night, Nina confirmed their fears. The secondary server, used primarily for archived communications, had been compromised. Someone with elevated clearance had accessed it and initiated a scrub. Automated scripts were running deletions across data clusters tied to Project Image. She managed to halt the process mid-run and preserve some fragments. But not all. Logs from the early planning stages were gone. Timestamped records from Leonard's early tenure were incomplete. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it stung. They were running out of time. Then, close to midnight, Jeremiah's phone lit up. An unknown number. No caller ID. One message. If you want this to end, I have an audio file. Leonard talked more than he should have at a private dinner last fall. But it's not free. Jeremiah stared at the screen. Heart thudding. Mind already moving through the possibilities. Who sent it? Was it real? Another trap? He looked across the dark office where Helen and Nina were still piecing together backup files. And muttered, so now we're buying truth like it's contraband. Jeremiah stepped into the lobby of a worn-down hotel just off Roosevelt Avenue in Queens. The place smelled like old carpet and cigarette ghosts. It wasn't the kind of place people wanted to be recognized in, which was probably why the meeting was here. At a corner booth in the back sat Eric Dunn, slouched in a windbreaker too thin for March. He looked older than Jeremiah remembered. Maybe it was the bitterness. Or maybe it was the year away from the boardrooms and bright lights. Eric didn't stand, didn't smile, just gestured toward the empty seat across from him. Jeremiah sat down. "You sent the message." Eric nodded, then pulled a flash drive from his pocket, setting it on the table like a poker chip. 47 minutes. Audio only. One night in Miami. One bottle too many. And too many people feeling invincible. Jeremiah didn't reach for it. "Why now?" Eric leaned forward, voice low. "Because I'm tired of pretending I was never part of it. But I'm not suicidal. Leonard's still got pull. Gavin's still got teeth. I'm not handing this over for free." Helen, who'd come in moments after Jeremiah and taken a seat nearby, stepped forward. "We don't pay for evidence. That's not how this works." Eric shrugged. "Then walk. But you're not gonna get this anywhere else." He pushed a second paper across the table. "I want an honorary return on paper. No real responsibilities. 6-figure severance for consulting. And I want it in writing that your team provides me legal protection if Leonard comes sniffing around." Helen opened her mouth, but Jeremiah raised a hand. "If I sign this," Jeremiah said quietly, "you sign a statement declaring you recorded the audio voluntarily. And you're willing to testify if needed." Eric nodded. "Just once." Later that night, back at headquarters, Helen ranted while they reviewed the recording. "We just bought justice off the black market. That's what it feels like." Jeremiah didn't disagree, but as Leonard's voice came through the speakers, clear, sharp, almost proud, he felt a knot tighten and release all at once. "You think customers come here for comfort, food, and politeness?" Leonard said in the recording. "We build an image, a brand, and people who don't match it drag it down. I'm not running a soup kitchen. I'm running a stage. And then, if you want good treatment, show me you're worth it. If you can't walk through that door looking the part, don't expect VIP service. No edits, no doubts, no denials left to hide behind." Jeremiah sat back. "We go public, internally first." The next day, a private hearing was scheduled under the guise of a quarterly leadership review. Everyone showed: managers, lawyers, board members, even a few outside observers who smelled scandal in the wind. Helen opened with a brief note on transparency. Then Jeremiah took the floor. No speech, no drama, just a file opened on a laptop, hooked to the projection screen. He hit play. The silence that followed the audio was louder than the recording itself. You could hear throat clears, shifting in seats, one or two gasps. Some managers glanced at each other. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Halfway through, Leonard stood. "This is illegal. You can't use this." Helen cut him off. The recording was made in a professional meeting where all parties were present. And no privacy clause was breached. "Our legal team has vetted it. This is admissible." Leonard's face twisted. "That's not me. That's not the full context." Jeremiah responded calmly. "It's enough context for us to know what's been happening under your leadership." Someone from the board asked, "Is this how you trained your managers?" Leonard didn't answer. He just stared at the screen as if it had betrayed him personally. Minutes later, he left the room without another word. But Jeremiah didn't feel victorious. He stood at the back of the conference room, arms crossed, watching the eyes of the people still seated. Some looked stunned, some ashamed. A few looked angry, but not at Leonard. Not anymore. The rot had been exposed. But whether the roots would be dug up or simply repainted, that was still unclear. The conference room on the top floor had never stayed lit this late. The council sat in stiff silence, the air thick with tension and lukewarm coffee. A few jackets had been tossed over chairs. Some ties loosened, others still knotted tight as if clinging to control. Helen stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching the streetlights below flicker like slow blinks. She hadn't said a word since the audio had played, just absorbed the fallout, reading every twitch and sideways glance in the room. One board member, Franklin Miles, finally broke the silence. "We should suspend Leonard immediately. Publicly. If we hesitate now, we'll look complicit. Another voice cut in, Cynthia Gray, head of investor relations. You do that, and by morning our stock value will be bleeding. We need to contain the story first, not pour gasoline on it. The arguments went back and forth, legal ramifications, PR damage, shareholder lawsuits, class actions, but no one could deny it. The mask had slipped. Meanwhile, Gavin Marr released a short statement through his legal team. Polished, vague. I did not authorize any policy promoting discrimination. If any party misapplied a framework for customer experience, that responsibility lies with them alone. Helen read the statement on her phone and shook her head. They're trying to outpace each other. Ditch the weight and run clean. Jeremiah sat quietly, fingers tented beneath his chin. He hadn't spoken in the last 20 minutes. But he'd been listening. Every phrase, every excuse, every attempt to soften the blow. Then Nina entered, holding a folder that hadn't come from any digital source. We found this, she said, her voice low but steady, in an offline backup from one of the old regional servers. It was labeled as a training archive. She opened the folder on the conference table. Inside were printed slides, labeled, Customer Profiling Guide, Internal Use Only. 17 branches had received these documents. Each slide showed images of different customer types, smiling white couples in tailored clothes marked as ideal. Black and Latino families labeled inconsistent with brand tone. Older women in supermarket uniforms flagged as potential service delays. No one in the room spoke. I think you've got your route, Nina said, setting the final piece on the table, a regional manager's email thanking Leonard's office for the clarity of expectations. Later that night, Haven and Hearth hosted its first ever live-streamed town hall, broadcast across all locations and made publicly accessible online. The stream opened on a quiet stage with one podium and the company's logo behind it. Bare and unpolished, Jeremiah stepped up, sleeves rolled, no tie, and looked directly into the lens. I built this company to stand for warmth, honesty, and dignity, he began, but I failed. Somewhere along the way, we let numbers matter more than people. We started filtering who we thought deserved respect. And I didn't see it. Or I didn't want to. Either way, I own it. There was no dramatic music. No applause. Just silence. He outlined the reforms, one by one. The training department, disbanded. The customer scoring system, dissolved and replaced by a transparent, equity-based feedback model. An external accountability panel, composed of civil rights advocates, former customers, and business ethics experts, would monitor the company's reform over the next year. No more shadow policies, he said, no more image-first filters, and no more looking away. He ended the address with a firm, quiet line. We cannot expect trust from the public if we only serve those who look the part and ignore those who live the reality. The broadcast ended, and silence returned to the boardroom. But the quiet didn't last long. An alert popped up on Jeremiah's screen. It was another anonymous message. This time simple, ominous. You cut off the branches. But the roots are still there. Are you sure no one on your board was pulling strings from the beginning? Jeremiah didn't move. His eyes lingered on the message before clicking the screen dark. Hours later, alone in his office, he stood by the window, watching the city buzz under a cloudy sky. Lights flickered in towers across Manhattan like restless thoughts refusing to sleep. He whispered to no one. Or maybe just to himself. Maybe this is where the real story begins. 1 week had passed since Jeremiah's public commitment to reform. The office halls no longer buzzed with hushed speculation but instead with a cautious sense of motion. Like a machine being restarted after years of running blind. The first official memo came early Monday morning. Leonard Trask was officially terminated for cause, following internal findings related to misconduct. A follow-up note confirmed Gavin Marr's departure from all advisory roles, citing early retirement due to personal reasons. The announcements were brief, cold, and calculated. The public applauded. Internally, employees exchanged glances that mixed relief with suspicion. Was that it? Jeremiah wanted to believe they had turned a corner. But the illusion didn't last. Midweek, a beige envelope appeared on his desk without a return address. Inside was a printed copy of a memo dated April 2021. Bearing the official letterhead of Haven and Hearth and the unmistakable signature of Carleen Voss. a founding board member and one of the company's oldest stakeholders. The memo was straightforward and damning. It authorized the pilot launch of image priority protocols as part of an initiative to elevate customer experience in northern market expansions. The language was slick but clear. This wasn't an accidental oversight. This was a green light. Carleen Voss, the same woman who once toasted him at the opening of the Chicago flagship, who told him over brandy that vision only matters if the money agrees. Now, she was the crack running through the wall he thought he'd reinforced. Jeremiah sat with the document for an hour before calling Nina and Helen. He didn't speak much during the meeting, just slid the paper across the table and watched both women read. Nina leaned back, exhaling sharply. If this memo is real, we've been pulling weeds while the roots were being watered. Helen was slower, methodical. We can't afford another scandal right now. You expose this, and we're looking at a media firestorm worse than anything Leonard caused. Shareholders, franchise partners, maybe even regulators. Jeremiah tapped the edge of the memo. And if we don't, we become the thing we just said we weren't. The room sat in silence. Nina eventually offered a path forward. What if we initiate an external audit? Fully independent. They get access to every decision, every file, every approval from the last 5 years. Let them uncover it. Let the truth speak without your hand on it. Helen nodded slowly. But if you do this, Jeremiah, they'll look at everything, including your choices. Every memo you co-signed. Every meeting you didn't question. He met their eyes without flinching. Then let them. If I'm part of the problem, people deserve to know that too. The next step was the board. Jeremiah called an emergency meeting. Half the board joined by video, half in person. Carleen sat at the head of the long table, wrapped in her signature gray shawl, the only one who seemed completely unbothered. He laid out the plan, a full, independent investigation by a civil oversight panel with legal authority to review all executive decisions and documentation. Transparent, uncompromised. Several members hesitated. Some feared exposure, others economic fallout. Carleen didn't hide her disapproval. This company lives and dies by its image, she said, voice clipped but deliberate. You're tearing down the very framework that built us. Jeremiah didn't raise his voice. If our framework was built on exclusion, it needs to come down. She scoffed. And what do you replace it with? Guilt? Ideals don't pay dividends. He didn't answer with a speech. He just held her gaze until she looked away. Eventually, after hours of tense deliberation, the board gave their reluctant consent. The investigation would begin immediately. A team of civic ethicists and legal experts would be given full oversight, including over Jeremiah's own records. That night, after everyone had gone, Jeremiah stood alone in his office. The city lights below shimmered like they always had, indifferent to his victories or losses. He opened his bottom drawer and pulled out the company's original founding contract. The document was weathered now, the ink faint in spots. He held it for a moment before placing it gently into the company's safe. He left the door open. On top of the document, he placed an old photograph, him and his father, standing in front of a small, rented storefront, both in work aprons, arms around each other. He heard his father's words like a whisper, as if spoken not just to him, but to whatever future this moment might bring. Being in charge is a privilege, but doing right, that's your legacy. 3 months later, the press conference was standing room only. Rows of reporters clutched their notepads and phones like weapons, ready to dissect whatever came next. At the center of the stage, a simple screen projected the title, Independent Audit Summary, Haven and Hearth. The report was over 300 pages long. Charts, quotes, timelines. It didn't pull punches. It named names. It exposed the subtle mechanics of discrimination hidden behind corporate gloss. Training scripts, customer evaluation forms, color-coded classifications, internal memos. Every piece of the machine laid bare. Carleen Voss resigned that morning. No press release, no explanation, just a formal notice submitted by her legal team. Others followed. 2 regional executives, 1 longtime board advisor, and the head of franchise development. Gavin Marr vanished quietly, shuttering his consultancy. Leonard Trask, now out of legal cover, faced a civil investigation launched by a national human rights group. The public's reaction split cleanly down the middle. Some accused Haven and Hearth of long-standing complicity, calling it a polished disguise for systemic exclusion. Others applauded the company's courage to confront its own darkness and begin something better. Jeremiah watched it all unfold from a deliberate distance. He turned down every exclusive interview, every podcast invitation, every sit-down TV special. He said yes to only one appearance, a quiet gathering with employees from across the company. It wasn't televised, no cameras, just people in folding chairs, notebooks in their laps, looking to him not as a CEO but as a man who'd seen something and chosen not to look away. He spoke slowly, clearly, not to impress, just to be heard. We don't get to be silent anymore. Not just in here, but in how we live, how we lead, how we listen. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Justice isn't a finish line. It's a starting point for change. Afterward, people lingered in small groups. Some in tears, some simply quiet. The ripple had reached them. Nina Garvey was appointed the new Chief of Customer Experience, the first in the company's history with full veto authority over policy that presented any risk of bias or unfair practice. Her office didn't have a nameplate on the door. She didn't want one. Marcus Hale returned, not as a consultant, but as Director of Technical Ethics and Data Integrity. His job wasn't just to build systems, but to challenge them when they drifted from purpose. Even Tasha, once pushed out for speaking up, now stood on a small stage in a training hall in Chicago. She was a guest speaker during orientation for the newest team of frontline employees. She told her story plainly, how she was dismissed, how she refused to stay silent, and how that silence broke open because others chose to listen. The room stayed quiet long after she stopped talking. Then slowly, people began to stand, one by one, a standing ovation, not for theatrics, but for truth spoken without bitterness. In the back row, Jeremiah sat alone, hands folded in his lap. He didn't wave, he didn't stand, he just smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. After the session, he slipped out through a side hallway. Unnoticed, the sun was starting to fall behind the skyline, throwing long shadows over the sidewalk. Outside, people moved in every direction, busy, tired, alive. As he crossed the street, a small boy, no older than 8, ran past him. Wearing a tiny Haven and Hearth apron, the kind sold in the company's kid-friendly line. The boy stopped for a second, looked up at Jeremiah, and smiled wide. No recognition in his eyes. Just a child smiling at a stranger. Jeremiah nodded back, just once, not a nod of approval or pride, a nod of belief in what could come next. Sometimes, the real power isn't in holding a title, it's in having the courage to challenge what hides behind it. Jeremiah didn't just change a company, he sparked a movement. Starting from a quiet act of being ignored. What would you do if you discovered injustice happening right under your own roof? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you don't want to miss more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind power, injustice, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths. Your support helps us keep these voices heard.